Good morning, everybody. We are Group 3, the Mechanical Engineering Group, and today we're going to compare and contrast Markle 548's for basic lab report elements questions with our lab report labeled Real-Time Motion Generation and Control of Biped Robot First Report Walking Gait Pattern Generation. So, number one, compare and contrast the basic elements of the report. So, the basic elements of a lab report consist of a title, an abstract, an introduction, materials and methods, results, discussions, conclusions, references, and the optional appendix and audience. So, for our first element, we have title. The title's job is to be informative and to persuade the reader into reading the title. As you can see with our lab element and with our lab report, the lab report's title is very specific and draws the reader in. For the abstract is a very brief paragraph which runs through the entire experiment in small sentences, usually about 1 to 2 sentences long, explaining the very important parts of each element and very important parts of each piece of the lab report and experiment. After our abstract, we have our introduction. The introduction establishes the importance of the lab report. The introduction will introduce the lab report, introduce the question, and any setup needed in the lab report. Now, after that, we have our materials and methods. However, this lab report does not have a materials and methods. Instead, it replaces materials and methods with diagrams and computations. However, if there were a materials and methods are a list of materials and methods in which the lab report can be easily replicable. After that, we have our results. The results basically give the data of each experiment done in trials. If there are 1 to 2 trials, 1 to 2 pieces of data will be given. And if there's any other added variables or factors, all the numbers and computations will be there in results. After results, there is usually a discussion to discuss any bit of results given. However, this report does not include a discussion, so we will go over that. After that, we have conclusion. The conclusion summarizes the main points of the lab report and of the experiment as a whole. We'll wrap up everything to the reader, and any leftover questions will be answered in the conclusion. After that, we have references. References are usually citations given at the end of the lab report on a reference page or section, and citations of any research used throughout the lab report. Now, for our optional pieces, we have the appendix. For the appendix in this lab report, it is given all the way at the bottom. And the purpose of an appendix, although optional, is that the appendix gives any base information. It gives information to the reader that will help them understand information inside of the lab report. For instance, this appendix talks about some equations and variables that will show up in computations done in our or where our materials and methods section is supposed to be. That is number one. Now moving to number two.
In number two, we are comparing the format of this lab report to a traditional lab report. To start off, this lab report contains a title, which clearly describes what it is talked about. Next is the authors. It clearly states the authors of this lab report, such as who is writing it. Next is the abstract, which briefly explains the lab report in a couple sentences to give you an overview of what you're expecting. Next is the introduction. In the introduction, it will be explaining certain aspects of the experiment that need to be briefed first, such as telling you that certain computations may not work on a real robot. Next is the results. Within the results, show you all the data that is accumulated throughout the experiment, such as various graphs and charts that can be read to explain what exactly is happening and what has been found through this experiment. Next is the conclusion, which briefly explains what has happened throughout the lab report and what can be done. Next is references. In this lab report specifically, the references are labeled by number, which can be found throughout the lab, which then lead back to specific citations, such as who wrote the who wrote the reference, what is being referred to, as well as the page numbers. And then next is the appendix. The appendix makes reading the lab report easier. In this specific case, it is telling you what certain variables are equal to better understand how their computations were done, as well as how to read certain charts and figures within the lab report. Next is on to number 3.
So this lab is different from the traditional elements of the writing lab report. And the authors chose that kind of formatting is because this lab report is basically a thought experiment. It is not a physical experiment that requires an actual set of materials and to conduct actual experiment. That is why this lab report is missing the materials and method part. Tries to find the zero moment point, a right dynamic balance point, so that the robot, when it walks, it can walk freely under a perfect balance without any kind of disturbance. So basically, it can move freely without any problems. To do that, they need to find out a point where the velocity, where the weight of the robot, where the distance the robot walks at a time, all these things have to fit together so that there is no problem in the motion of the robot. So the robot have to have all these data, and to do that, they calculate the assumptions for. That's why the lab explains the equations. Now they don't explain the equations like what they do. They only explain what equations and calculations they went through. So it mentions the equation, and then it tells that they went through the calculation, and it tells the result. Same for the modelings. The lab mentions three dynamic modelings, but they don't explain what the modelings do or where they came from. They only just labels down each modeling, and it labels down the data under it. So they don't really tell where they got those data from because it's all assumption. They only tell you that they went through the calculation. So the entire lab basically labels down the calculation and the data they have, the input and the output, which is the result. And they have there's the most ideal data on the results section. That's why the lab is also missing the discussion section, because entire lab itself is basically a discussion about the most ideal, the balance point. They don't for the and then to do that, they explain all those assumptions that they went through in the sections, and they label down what they have as a result. So entire all of that is basically a discussion. Next, number 4.
A question the class might ask is, how is the information organized? It includes labeled sections in which there is information. Thank you all for listening.